Strategic managers need to be good at two things. First of all, they do need ideas, models, concepts to help them think their strategy through. But secondly, and most importantly, they do have to know how to take those models and apply them to the sector that they work in and the specific circumstances of their own organisation. So the model which you've seen in your programme about strategic management shows all the various aspects of strategy. And what I'll do in this presentation is just choose a few of those models that you're familiar with and show how they apply to three different types of organisation. The first one we're going to look at will be the small family business. And here I've chosen a small grocery store, what in the UK we would call the corner shop. The second one we're going to look at is a global organisation, one which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. We'll look at Microsoft. And thirdly, we'll look at a public sector organisation, again one which most of you will be familiar with, a hospital. The first model, which you will have probably done quite early in your studies, is called the PESTLE framework. Now, if you remember, this framework looks at the big general changes in an organisation's business environment and for convenience just puts them into these 6 categories. Now, how would this model apply to our 3 organisations? Well, if you think about it, if I'm a small family-owned shop and there's these great big things going on in my business environment, I really can't influence them at all. So my attitude has got to be, can I understand them and how do I actually cope with them? At the other end of the scale, Microsoft, of course, as a large global organisation, is in quite a different relationship with their business environment. They're big, therefore they don't just have to cope, they can influence what goes on, at least in parts of the business environment. Indeed, in the case of Microsoft, we all know they've gone beyond that. They've actually created quite big parts of the business environment, both for themselves and for others. Obviously, the whole issue of information technology. But even for strong, big organisations, there'll be parts of that business environment which can be difficult for them. And they may have to know how to defend against political criticism, for example, or difficult economic trends. Now, the hospital, fairly typical of a public sector organisation, because its purposes are about making all our lives better, not surprisingly, the social environment and the political environment tend to be of particular concern to a hospital. Now, within those general trends in the business environment, we also need to understand those changes and trends which are much closer to an organisation. In the private sector, we would call it the competitive environment. And you will have used Porter's 5 forces to analyse that framework. But what in that framework will be most important to our 3 organisations? If I'm a corner shop, what I'm going to be mainly concerned about are other shops like myself. So they're my rivals. How can I outwit my rivals? So it's my tactics which are so important. There are other rather big organisations which I really need to avoid. Of course, the supermarkets. And I'll probably do that in terms of key decisions about where I'll locate myself. Now, Microsoft has been quite well known for how it's pursued its competitive strategy. And in fact, in some cases, it's been criticised. It's tried to raise barriers to entry and make it quite difficult for others to compete. It's also tied us all in as users. And again, there have been issues about whether that was anti-competitive. But that's how a big organisation might try to shape its competitive environment. Even in the public sector, like the hospital, the idea of competition and these 5 forces matters too. For example, whereas healthcare used to be, in many countries, purely public sector, now private sector providers of healthcare are allowed to enter as well. So looking at new entrants is an important issue in the public sector too. And in many countries, there's now an arm's length customer-supplier relationship between the hospital, which receives patients, from family doctors. So that relationships with the family doctors as suppliers is also very important. If organisations are going to succeed, they have to worry about quite a few things. And of course, one of those is cost. And this is a model you will have seen about how an organisation can actually become more cost efficient. But of course, not all of 4 of these forces are going to be equally important to all organisations. So let's see how they would apply. In the shop's case, small business trying to compete or avoid supermarkets, in fact they have very few cost advantages. So this means that they wouldn't try to take on the supermarkets in terms of price. They'd have to win in some other ways, and we'll look at those later. Microsoft has got two major areas where it can get major advantage in cost over its competitors. First of all, incredible economies of scale. It costs several $1 million to produce the first copy of the software and just a few cents to produce the second. And of course experience. As the largest player in its business, then it really should become much more experienced than any potential new entrants, and therefore have a much better cost structure. In the case of the hospital, the arguments of experience also apply. And beyond that, there may be other ways in which the hospital becomes very cost efficient. This would actually vary depending on which part of medical care you were looking at. But for example, if you looked at orthopaedics, where people go with broken bones, the way in which that is organised is very much like a factory, using factory principles for cost efficiency. Even when there are opportunities in your business environment, as you know, you have to be capable to take advantage of them. And this is our model to look at strategic capability. It's a very simple model. It tells us, first of all, that capability is partly to do with resources, that's things that you have, and also to do with things that you do and how competent you are at those. And the top line of the model is concerned with the basic level which you must achieve if you're going to stay in business. And the bottom line is about competing better, having advantage, or in the public sector we'd probably call this being recognised as excellent. So when we look at the shop, the corner shop, how are they going to win? What are they going to be better at than, say, the supermarkets? Well, really, it's going to come down to two things. They're not going to be able to compete on price, so they must provide better service. So service is a core competence. But in fact, that core competence only exists because they have a unique resource, and that unique resource is the owner-manager of the business. Microsoft has really found its market dominance not because it has individual products which are better. I don't think Word is the best word processing package. I don't think Excel is the best spreadsheet. But what they do is allow us to integrate all of those separate packages. And therefore, they actually provide us with solutions which customers value. So that's the core competence of Microsoft. In the hospital, their capability and success would vary very much by specialism. Again, if we look at orthopaedics, fixing broken bones, then in fact the competencies on how you organise that factory would be very important indeed. In contrast, if you're looking at lead-edge medicine, perhaps brain surgery, the competence probably exists in a few very clever medical doctors. In other words, it's the unique resource which helps them win. Strategy is also about some softer things. Things that in the book we call expectations and purposes. And this is a diagram that tries to look at what those softer issues are. And it tries to answer the question, what determines the purposes of an organisation? Why do they pursue some things and not others? And it's really to do with two sorts of things. On the left-hand side, these are what we would call the political pressures. And on the right-hand side, we call them the cultural pressures. Now, if I'm running my own family business, the thing which will determine more than anything what we do and what we don't do is simply the dominant owner, the wishes of the dominant owner. So there we have, in the bottom left-hand box, the dominant stakeholder, the person who owns the business. Microsoft, like all big businesses, is a complicated mixture of these pressures. It is slightly unusual because it too is very dominant in its industry, more dominant than you would find in many other sectors. But it has run into some difficulties in the top two boxes in the model. Issues about corporate governance and issues about business ethics, organisations tend to develop approaches which might work well in your home country, but in fact don't work quite so well when you try to globalise and move all around the world. So governance and ethics are very critically important issues for globalising organisations. Now, the thing about the public sector, the hospital, is that all of these forces are going to shape the purposes. They're often in contradiction each other, and public sector organisations are trying to sort out purposes whilst they're very much in the public eye. So this is quite difficult for public sector organisations to get it right. So organisations have to take what we call an ethical stance. And this diagram really looks at a spectrum of stances. Number one is about really the business of my business is just business. And if government wants us to do other things, they'd better change the laws. Right through to number four, which would be an organisation whose purpose in life is to shape and improve society as a whole. Now, if we look at our three organisations and their ethical stance, not surprisingly, a small family-owned business will be very close to number one. In other words, they make decisions very much in the interests of the business itself and keeping their family in a good standard of living. Microsoft may choose to think that it could do number one, but in fact most big businesses really, at a minimum, have to be number two. In other words, they actually have to take on board the legitimate interests of other stakeholders like communities, customers, suppliers. Otherwise, they really won't make money for their shareholders. The hospital is quite an interesting example of how the public sector has moved in the last 20 years. Then you would find that many public sector organisations would see themselves very much as shapers of society. And the financial issues were a bit of a nuisance, as something you just had to get right while you got on with your real purpose. But over the last 20 years, largely for reasons of taxation and keeping tax levels down, most public sector organisations have had to move from 4 to 3. In other words, achieving social purposes within financial limits. The strategy clock is an important model. It's really about how organisations might choose to position themselves in their markets. And number one on the clock, for example, partly along with number two, are organisations who are going to position themselves in that part of the market which are looking for a no-frills offering and reasonably low prices. Right through to number five, which we could probably call a customised product or service, where the product or service is designed separately for each individual customer. And of course, they're prepared to pay a price premium for that. Most small family businesses would not try to compete on price. They would try to position themselves near a 4 or 5 on the clock by offering something better in the product or improved service rather than lower prices. In contrast, big businesses like Microsoft probably eventually are trying to work themselves towards number 3 on this clock. Because number 3 on the clock is quite difficult to compete against. Because what it says is that we offer both the best benefits in our products and service and also the best prices as well. The public sector, mainly, because it receives taxpayers' money, the expectation is that most of the services will be near probably number 2 on the clock. In other words, cost efficient, but good quality, but not having things that the taxpayers not really prepared to pay for. But of course, that's not true of all the specialisms in a hospital. Some specialist areas like brain surgery, heart and lung transplants, for example, which exist in just some hospitals and not all of them, they're called centres of excellence, and therefore they are positioned rather like number 4 or 5 on the clock. Strategy is about the future, and therefore, however well an organisation's doing, they're probably going to have to change and develop over time. And this model, which originally was Igor Ansof's model, gives us a little checklist of what those development directions might be. The shop, like most service organisations, usually has a strength in having a very good knowledge of its current customers, usually in its locality. and therefore their future development tends to be dominated by product or service development. In other words, as the needs of that particular customer group change, so we develop and add new products and drop some products as well. Microsoft's quite different. As a large dominant organisation, it's probably used up many of the opportunities in three of these boxes. So first of all, it dominated its original market. Secondly, it developed a range of new products for that market. Thirdly, it developed new markets all around the world and dominated those. So now its development is largely limited to the diversification box. And like most organisations involved in diversification, they will tend to favour things which are related to their current business. So in the case of Microsoft, who first of all developed software and operating systems for standalone PCs, their developments then came into how they would dominate the internet through web browsers and so on. The hospital, of course, is also a service organisation, and therefore product development is dominated. They're there to serve the medical needs of their region, and as they change, perhaps with demographic changes, so the services available in the hospital have to change too. But in fact, for some specialist hospitals, they've been encouraged to offer their services more widely, not just in their region, but in other parts of the country, and for the real centres of excellence, they would offer them internationally as well. So there is some element of market development, although it tends to be dominated by product development. For any direction of development, an organisation still has to decide the method they will use to achieve it. And there are three broad methods. First of all, they could do it themselves. This is what we call internal development. Secondly, they could merge or acquire an organisation who is already doing it. So this is merger and acquisitions. Or thirdly, they could actually work with another organisation and do it in partnership. This is what we call strategic alliances. Small family businesses like the shop are usually going to favour internal development, doing things themselves, for two main reasons. One is that their resource base is quite limited, and therefore they can't afford to take over another organisation, or they may be dominated by a partner. And that leads us to the second reason, which is control. People who set up their own businesses usually like to control them and keep them to themselves, and are not very keen on working with partners. Microsoft, our example of a global organisation, in this particular instance, isn't really terribly typical. You would find global organisations probably being forced to develop by merger and acquisition, or alliances, or a combination of the two. But of course, there's an important practicality here. If you're the organisation which has created an industry and dominated it, there may be no one for you to acquire, or no one for you to work with. And therefore, the degree of internal development in Microsoft is unusual for that particular category of global organisations. Hospitals, like many public sector organisations, historically have tried to do things pretty much themselves. But that's quite difficult and, in many cases, terribly inefficient. And one of the missions of governments in the last 15 years, whilst trying to make the public sector more efficient, is to encourage them to work in partnership. In fact, there are many public sector developments where, in fact, it's only partnership will work. For example, if you're tackling very difficult issues like drugs, hospitals would have to work with education, with social services, and with the police. Structures are often where managers start when they're trying to change organisations, and they are important. But the way you would tackle structure and make structural decisions obviously has to relate to the kind of organisation you are. Almost by definition, a small family business is going to adopt a simple structure. So the owner is both the main shareholder, the managing director, the marketing director, the financial director, and does all the work in the shop as well. In contrast, big organisations like Microsoft usually have to have quite sophisticated structures. In fact, usually a mixture of some of these pure types. So you'd find with Microsoft that the product development side will be organised globally. So in that sense, it's a global product company. But there are key business functions which have to underpin that. The human resources function, the financial function, and they will be organised that way. And even though Microsoft has dominated all its markets, there are differences in terms of how products are presented, sold and supported in different parts of the world. So those functions may be organised more regionally, on a geographical basis. Hospitals, like many public sector organisations, tend to adopt a fairly complicated structure, which we'd probably call a matrix structure, although others would call it team-based or project-based. This means that some staff will be organised by their specialism, so the orthopaedic surgeons are organised together, whereas the patients may in fact have to be addressed by their age. So in fact we might have to have a mixed team to deal with geriatrics, which is old people, or paediatrics, which is young people. And the matrix is a very common form of structure in many public sector organisations. Structure is just the skeleton of an organisation. We have to make it work. So within the structure we have to have management processes, and here are some of them. We may have to directly supervise the work of people. We may have systems that do that job. We may in fact allow a lot of the organisation to be given to those individuals, which is what we call self-control. Or we may have norms of behaviour which controls the things that the organisation does. We may set targets. We may have complicated customer-supplier relationships inside the organisation that we call market mechanisms. The corner shop, the family business, has very few people, so it's all about self-control, the personal drive and motivation of the owner-manager of the business. And of course that's why many family businesses don't survive the first generation, because that personal motivation really doesn't exist in the next generation down. Microsoft's a big, complicated global business, and you'd expect quite a complicated mixture of different kinds of processes. Obviously, personal motivation is very important in the creative side of the business. So those people writing software and developing operating systems really got to be given some space to do that. And that will go alongside what we will call social control. In other words, the norms and behaviours of how we actually work in Microsoft will be quite dominant in terms of what individuals do and what they don't do. But other sides of the business need to be run through tight systems and procedures. Otherwise, great ideas businesses never bring things to market and never make money, even if they do bring it to the market. And Microsoft's an example, I think, of blending that very open form of management for the creative people with tight administrative controls to make sure that the business works. Hospital, again, has lots of clever people like Microsoft does, and therefore those social and self-control processes are very important for the medical staff. But then we have another set of people, the hospital managers and all their administrative support teams, who are there to make sure that the hospital works as a business, that budgets aren't overspent and so on. Now in this case, because the two types of control are in two different groups of people, the medical people and the managers, often this has proved to be quite a big source of friction. So what I've tried to do in this presentation is to remind you that if you are going to be a good strategic manager, you do have to be good at these two things. You do have to understand models and concepts, the kind of things that we've shown in our model, and some of which I've looked at today. This is really a safeguard against just making up strategy as issues arise. But just understanding the models, as you might do as a student, isn't going to be enough for a practicing manager. You have to know how you take those models and apply them to your sector and to your specific organisation. And some of the models will be more important than others, and some aspects within a model will be more important than others. And I hope this presentation has helped you with that.